How one pilot's crazy landing method cut carrier crashes by 80%. Imagine a floating graveyard made of steel. Imagine a floating graveyard made of steel. That's what some pilots called aircraft carriers in the early jet age. These massive ships, symbols of naval power, were also one of the most dangerous places on Earth for a pilot. The flight deck was a chaotic dance of men and machines, where a single mistake could be fatal. Jets roared, catapults fired, and in the middle of it all, pilots had to land on a moving target smaller than a football field, often in rough seas and terrible weather. The danger was constant, the pressure immense. Before World War II, the U.S. Navy lost more aircraft to operational accidents than to enemy fire. It was a grim reality of naval aviation. Landing a high-speed jet on a carrier has been described as trying to thread a needle in a hurricane. Pilots called it the postage stamp. This tiny moving patch of steel in a vast, unforgiving ocean was their only hope of a safe return. They had to hit this target perfectly every single time. The landing area itself is incredibly short, and it's not stationary. The carrier is constantly pitching, rolling, and heaving with the waves. On top of that, it's moving forward at over 30 knots. The pilot has to account for the ship's movement, the wind over the deck, and their own aircraft's speed and descent rate, all at the same time. It's a complex, three-dimensional problem that has to be solved in seconds, with zero room for error. For decades, the standard procedure for landing on a carrier was a technique that, in hindsight, seems almost suicidal. It was called the power-off landing. Pilots would approach the carrier, cut their engine power to idle, and essentially glide the last few feet onto the deck. The idea was to stall the aircraft just as it touched down, causing it to drop firmly onto the deck and catch an arresting wire. This method was a holdover from the days of slower, propeller-driven planes. But with the advent of faster, heavier jets, it became incredibly dangerous. Early jet engines had a fatal flaw. They spooled up very slowly. If a pilot missed the wires and needed to go around for another attempt to bolter, it could take several critical seconds for the engine to produce enough thrust to get airborne again. In those seconds, the aircraft would often just drop into the sea. One of the most terrifying types of landing accidents was the ramp strike. This is when the aircraft comes in too low and its tailhook or landing gear smacks into the very edge of the flight deck's rear, known as the ramp. The result is almost always catastrophic. The impact had ripped the tail off the plane, cause it to cartwheel across the deck in a fiery explosion, or send it plunging into the carrier's wake. Ramp strikes were a direct consequence of the steep, gliding approach of the power-off landing. Pilots were trying to drop the plane onto the deck, and it was terrifyingly easy to misjudge the angle by a fraction of a degree. A slight downdraft or a moment of inattention could lead to disaster. The sound of a ramp strike was something no one on a carrier ever forgot. The numbers tell a chilling story. In the early 1950s, during the Korean War, the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps were losing an astonishing number of aircraft and pilots. The statistics were grim. For every one plane lost in combat, nearly 8 were lost in operational accidents. Think about that. The daily routine of flying from a carrier was 8 times more dangerous than facing enemy fighters and anti-aircraft fire. The flight deck was a more lethal enemy than anything the adversary could throw at them. These weren't just statistics. They were friends, squadron mates, and promising young aviators, lost not in the heat of battle, but in the unforgiving physics of a carrier landing. This staggering loss rate created a crisis that threatened the very effectiveness of naval aviation. The Navy was facing a severe pilot shortage. Experienced pilots, the veterans who formed the backbone of the squadrons, were being lost at an unsustainable rate. Morale plummeted. Many talented pilots, seeing the writing on the wall, simply resigned their commissions rather than continue to risk their lives in what seemed like a game of Russian roulette. The Navy was bleeding its best and brightest, and something had to be done. They needed a new way to land, a way that didn't involve cutting the power and praying. The entire concept of carrier aviation was at a breaking point. Enter a man named Commander George Duncan. A seasoned naval aviator, Duncan had seen enough friends die. He believed there had to be a better way. He started experimenting with a radical new landing technique, one that went against everything pilots had been taught. Instead of cutting the power, Duncan advocated for keeping the power on throughout the entire approach. He proposed flying a steady, constant angle descent, using the engine to precisely control the aircraft's glide path. The idea was to fly the plane right into the deck, not glide onto it. This way, if the pilot missed the wires, the engine was already spooled up, providing instant power for a safe go-around. At first, the old guard was horrified. His idea was met with huge resistance. Flying a jet under power straight at the back of the ship? It sounded crazy, reckless. The established doctrine was to cut power, to stall it onto the deck. Duncan's method seemed to invite disaster. He was told it was too dangerous, that it would lead to even more accidents. But Duncan was persistent. He knew the physics and the aerodynamics. He argued that his method gave the pilot more control, not less. It took the guesswork out of the landing, and most importantly, it gave them an escape route if things went wrong. Duncan's persistence paid off. He was eventually allowed to test his theory, and the results were nothing short of revolutionary. Using his powered approach, pilots found they had far more control during the most critical phase of the landing. They could make tiny, precise adjustments with the throttle to stay exactly on the desired glide slope. The constant descent angle made judging the approach much easier. Most importantly, the fear of the slow spooling engine vanished. A bolter was no longer a near-death experience. It was a routine, safe maneuver. You just pushed the throttle to the firewall and climbed away. The new technique, combined with the invention of the angled flight deck and the optical landing system, transformed carrier aviation. Accident rates plummeted. Within a few years of adopting Duncan's method, major carrier landing accidents were reduced by a staggering 80%. Ramp strikes, once a common nightmare, became incredibly rare. The floating graveyard became one of the safest environments in military aviation. George Duncan's crazy idea didn't just save a few lives, it saved thousands. It ensured the viability of naval air power for generations to come. Today, every carrier pilot in the world uses the principles pioneered by Commander Duncan. It's a testament to how one person's courage to challenge a deadly tradition can change everything. The visionary, James Flatley, and his heretical idea. His name was Commander James "Jimmy" Flatley. A seasoned pilot and a natural leader, Flatley watched in horror as his men, his friends, struggled with the standard landing procedure. The official flight manual had a very specific set of instructions. Cut your engine power completely, glide in low and slow, and let the tailhook catch the arresting wire. It was called the power off or stall landing. The idea was to land at the slowest possible speed to minimize impact. Sounds logical, right? But in practice, it was a death trap. Flatley noticed a terrifying pattern. As pilots chopped their throttles, their planes would often lose lift too quickly. The nose would dip or a wing would drop just moments before touchdown. With no power, the pilot was just a passenger in a falling machine. They couldn't correct their altitude or alignment. The result was often catastrophic: landing gear collapsing, propellers shattering on the deck, or worse, the plane bouncing over the safety barriers and into the ocean. The problem wasn't the pilots, it was the procedure. This is where Flatley's genius came in. He proposed something that sounded like complete insanity to the naval aviation establishment. He called it the power-on approach. Instead of cutting the engine, he told his pilots to keep a steady amount of power all the way down to the deck. They would fly in a flatter, more controlled glide path, maintaining a slightly higher speed. The engine's thrust would keep the plane stable and responsive, giving the pilot precious control right up to the moment the tailhook snagged the wire. When Flatley presented his idea, the backlash was immediate and fierce. Senior officers and engineers were furious. "You'll burn the deck," they shouted. "The planes aren't designed for that. You'll rip the hooks right off." They believed that landing with power would create too much force, stressing the aircraft and the carrier's arresting gear beyond their limits. The official flight manual was treated like sacred text, and Flatley was committing heresy. He was told in no uncertain terms to stick to the book or face a court-martial. But Flatley knew he was right. He understood the physics better than the engineers sitting behind desks. The power-on approach wasn't about speed. It was about stability. With the engine running, the propeller's airflow over the wings and control surfaces gave the pilot authority over the aircraft. He could make tiny, precise adjustments to stay perfectly lined up. It turned a terrifying, uncontrolled fall into a smooth, predictable flight path. It was the difference between dropping a rock and guiding a kite. Convinced he was saving lives, Flatley decided to bet his entire career on his idea. He defied direct orders. In secret, he started training his own squadron, the famous Grim Reapers, in his new technique. He told them to ignore the flight manual. He personally demonstrated the power-on landing again and again, proving it was not only possible, but significantly safer. He would fly in, engine humming, and make a perfect, controlled landing every time. His pilots saw the difference immediately. Their confidence soared. The landings were smoother, the stress was lower, and most importantly, the crashes stopped. The change was dramatic. Within Flatley's squadron, landing accidents plummeted. Word began to spread throughout the fleet. Other squadrons, seeing the Grim Reaper's incredible safety record, started unofficially adopting Flatley's method. The evidence became too overwhelming for the top brass to ignore. They couldn't argue with the results. Flatley wasn't just some crazy rule breaker. He was a visionary who had solved their biggest problem. Eventually, the Navy had to concede. They officially rewrote the flight manual, making Flatley's power-on approach the new standard procedure for all carrier landings. The impact was revolutionary. Across the entire U.S. Navy, carrier landing accidents dropped by an astonishing 80%. Think about that. 4 out of every 5 accidents eliminated. Countless lives were saved, and thousands of aircraft were preserved to fight another day, all because one man dared to challenge the status quo. Jimmy Flatley's story is a powerful lesson in innovation and courage. He saw a problem, analyzed it from a pilot's perspective, and trusted his own experience over outdated rules. He risked his career to protect his men, and in doing so, he changed naval aviation forever. His crazy idea is now the foundation of how every carrier pilot in the world lands their aircraft. It's a legacy of stability over speed, of control over chaos, and of a leader who put his people first. The 80% miracle, testing the constant speed method. In 1953, the Navy, desperate for a solution, gave Ramage the green light to test his theory. He gathered a small team of pilots from his squadron, VF-191, to form a special test unit. The location for this groundbreaking experiment was the Naval Air Station at Moffett Field, California. On the ground, they painted a replica of a carrier flight deck. The stage was set for what would either be a breakthrough or a spectacular failure. Ramage and his hand-picked pilots began their trials. The first few attempts were nerve-wracking. The flight line, usually a cacophony of engines and shouted commands, fell eerily silent as these pilots approached the painted deck. They weren't gliding. They were flying in under power, their engines humming a steady tune. Instead of the familiar chop the power and flare technique, they were using their throttles to make tiny adjustments, controlling their sink rate with surgical precision. Onlookers held their breath. This was completely alien. It looked wrong. It felt wrong. But then, something amazing happened. The planes touched down, not with a bone-jarring slam, but with a firm, controlled plant. They were consistently hitting their mark, right where the arresting cables would be on a real carrier. One of the key innovations that emerged from these early tests was the ancestor of what pilots today call the meatball. Ramage knew that to make this powered approach work, pilots needed a reliable visual reference to maintain the perfect glide slope. They couldn't just eyeball it. So he and his team got creative. They rigged up a simple but brilliant system. They placed a series of lights on the side of the runway. When a pilot was on the correct glide path, the lights would appear perfectly aligned. If they were too high, the lights would shift one way. Too low, and they'd shift the other. This primitive visual landing aid gave pilots a constant, real-time feedback loop. They could see their position relative to the ideal glide path and make immediate throttle corrections to stay locked in. This simple array of lights was the first step toward the sophisticated optical landing systems used on carriers today. It was a game changer, turning a seat-of-your-pants maneuver into a repeatable data-driven procedure. The pilot's focus shifted from guessing their descent to simply keeping the lights aligned. The real secret to Ramage's method was the mastery of sync rate. In the old glide method, the sync rate was largely a function of the initial approach and any last-second corrections. A gust of wind or a slight misjudgment could lead to a dangerously high sync rate, resulting in a hard landing that could shatter landing gear or even break the plane's back. With the powered approach, the pilot was in direct command of the sync rate. By adding a touch of power, they could slow their descent. By reducing it slightly, they could increase it. They were actively flying the airplane onto the ground. This meant they could precisely manage the energy of the aircraft at the moment of impact. The goal was no longer just to arrive on the deck, but to arrive with a specific survivable vertical speed. This level of control was unprecedented. It took the terrifying variable of the burble, the turbulent air that flows over the back of the carrier, and gave pilots a tool to fight through it. They could power through downdrafts that would have previously sent a gliding aircraft plummeting toward the steel deck. After weeks of land-based trials, it was time to take the experiment to sea. Aboard the USS Princeton, Ramage's team prepared to prove their concept in the most challenging environment imaginable. The initial results were nothing short of astonishing. The numbers spoke for themselves. In the squadrons that adopted Ramage's constant speed approach, the rate of major landing accidents, specifically those involving broken landing gear, plummeted. We're not talking about a small improvement of 10 or 20%. The data showed a dramatic drop, in some cases as high as 80%. The number of planes damaged beyond repair fell off a cliff. Maintenance crews who were used to constantly repairing bent and broken struts suddenly found themselves with less work. The statistics were undeniable. This wasn't a fluke. The crazy idea worked, and it worked spectacularly well. The data provided the irrefutable proof needed to convince even the most hardened skeptics. The Navy had found its miracle. The transformation in opinion was swift and decisive. What was once whispered about as Ramage's folly or Jig Dog's crazy idea was now being hailed as genius. Senior officers who had initially scoffed at the concept were now demanding that their squadrons be trained in the new technique. The word spread like wildfire through the fleet. The visual landing aid system was refined and installed on carriers across the Navy, evolving into the frontal lens optical landing system, or FLOLS, that is still fundamental to carrier ops today. Ramage's method became the new standard. It was officially written into the Naval Air Training and Operating Procedure Standardization Program, the bedrock of naval aviation. Within a remarkably short period, an entire generation of naval aviators was retrained, and every new pilot learned the powered approach from day one. Jig Dog Ramage, the pilot who dared to challenge a half-century of aviation dogma, had not only saved countless aircraft and millions of dollars, but more importantly, he had saved the lives of his fellow pilots. His legacy is etched into every single carrier landing that happens today, a testament to the power of innovative thinking and the courage to fly against the wind. The LSO factor, the unsung heroes of the paddle. To understand the genius of this new method, we first need to meet the unsung heroes of the carrier deck, the landing signal officers, or LSOs. Picture this. Standing on a small platform at the edge of the flight deck, Exposed to the elements and the roar of engines is a man holding what looks like a pair of colorful ping-pong paddles. This is the LSO. He's the pilot's eyes, ears, and guardian angel during those critical final seconds of approach. His job is to guide the aircraft safely onto the deck using a precise language of hand signals. He's not just an observer. He's an active participant in every single landing. Before the change, the LSO's word was law. He was the conductor of a very dangerous orchestra. Historically, carrier landings were a delicate dance of power and precision. The standard procedure involved the pilot flying a long, flat approach, gradually reducing power and sinking toward the deck. The LSO would use his paddles to signal adjustments. A little high, a bit low, nose up. The goal was to get the plane into the perfect position just over the stern, at which point the LSO would give the cut signal. This was an abrupt, slashing motion with the paddle, ordering the pilot to immediately cut the engine power to idle. The plane would then drop onto the deck, hopefully catching one of the arrestor wires. It was a nerve-wracking process. A moment's hesitation, a slight misjudgment, and disaster could strike. A ramp strike, where the plane hits the back edge of the carrier, was a pilot's worst nightmare. The cut was a mandatory, all-or-nothing command. Enter Lieutenant Commander James H. Flatley, Jr., a seasoned naval aviator. While training new pilots in the Grumman F-6F Hellcat, he noticed a terrifying trend. The Hellcat was a magnificent fighter, powerful, rugged, and heavily armed. But it was also heavy, and its weight made the traditional landing technique incredibly perilous. Pilots were struggling. The flat approach and the mandatory power cut were leading to an alarming number of hard landings and devastating ramp strikes. The Hellcat was earning a reputation as a difficult plane to bring home. Flatley knew something had to change, or he'd lose more pilots in training than in combat. His solution was unconventional, to say the least. Instead of a long, flat approach, Flatley taught his pilots to maintain a slightly higher altitude and fly a continuous descending turn all the way to the deck. This kept their speed up and gave them more energy to react. But the most radical part was what happened at the end. Flatley completely reimagined the role of the cut signal. He told his LSO, a young officer named Robbie Robinson, to change the signal's meaning. Instead of a mandatory order to kill the power, the cut would now become a signal of affirmation. It meant, "You're good, your approach is perfect. Continue what you're doing and land." The pilot would no longer chop the throttle, but would fly the plane directly onto the deck under power. If the approach wasn't perfect, the LSO would give a wave-off signal, telling the pilot to go around and try again. No more last-second, high-stakes gambles. This new system was all about communication and trust. It created a brand new language between the pilot in the cockpit and the LSO on the platform. The pilot was no longer just a passive receiver of commands. He was now an active partner in the landing. The pilot's focus shifted from desperately trying to hit a specific spot to maintaining a perfect, stable approach. The LSO, in turn, became less of a traffic cop and more of a coach, confirming that the pilot was on the right track. This continuous power-on approach gave the pilot an incredible safety net. If he missed the wires, he had enough power and airspeed to simply fly off the end of the deck and come around for another attempt. The dreaded stall and drop onto the deck was a thing of the past. The psychology of this change was profound. It replaced fear with confidence. Pilots no longer felt like they were at the mercy of a single final command. They knew they were in control of the aircraft until the very moment the wheels touched down. They had to place immense trust in the man with the paddles, believing that his cut signal was a confirmation of their own skill, not an order to surrender control. This built a powerful bond between the pilots and their LSOs. The LSO wasn't just signaling. He was sharing the responsibility of the landing. He was betting his own judgment on the pilot's ability to execute a perfect approach. And the pilots, in turn, trusted that the LSO would never let them land if the situation wasn't safe. The results were nothing short of miraculous. When Flatley's squadron, VF-10, deployed to the Pacific, their accident rate plummeted. While other Hellcat squadrons were still struggling with the old method, losing planes and pilots at an alarming rate, Flatley's men were landing their heavy fighters with unprecedented safety and consistency. The word spread like wildfire through the fleet. Here was a squadron flying the same difficult plane but without the crashes. What was their secret? The secret was the Flatley method. Other squadrons began to adopt the technique, and everywhere it was implemented, the same thing happened. Accidents dropped dramatically. The new system didn't just tame the Hellcat. It made landing every carrier aircraft safer. It's estimated that this single change in procedure reduced carrier landing accidents by as much as 80% across the entire U.S. Navy. It was a revolution born from necessity. It challenged decades of doctrine and required a complete shift in mindset. But by empowering the pilot and redefining the partnership with the LSO, it solved one of the deadliest problems in naval aviation. The legacy of this crazy idea is still visible today. While paddles have been replaced by sophisticated optical landing systems, the core philosophy remains the same: a stable, powered approach, with the pilot flying the aircraft all the way to the deck. It is a testament to the ingenuity and courage of aviators like Flatley and the countless LSOs who stood on that platform, guiding their pilots home. They proved that sometimes, the most revolutionary ideas are the ones that trust the skill of the person at the controls. The modern tailhook: how a World War II madman shaped the future. Then came the jet age, and suddenly Flatley's method wasn't just a good idea. It was an absolute necessity. Early jets had a critical flaw: their engines spooled up slowly. If a jet pilot tried the old dive and drive technique and missed the wires, they couldn't just slam the throttle and power up for another try. The engine wouldn't respond fast enough, and a bolter, or a missed landing, would almost certainly end in the ocean. The flat-powered approach that Flatley pioneered became the only viable way to land these new, faster, heavier aircraft. By keeping the engine spooled up during the final approach, a pilot who missed the wires had enough immediate power to climb away safely and circle around for another attempt. What was once seen as a risky alternative became the cornerstone of modern carrier operations, saving the jet age from being a complete disaster at sea. Of course, a new technique requires new tools. To make the flat approach even more precise, the Navy developed the Optical Landing System, or OLS. You've probably seen it in movies. It has that set of lights on the side of the carrier deck. The core of this system is a gyroscopically stabilized mirror that projects a beam of light, which pilots call the meatball. The pilot's job is to keep the meatball aligned with a row of green datum lights. If the meatball is above the green lights, you're too high. If it's below, you're too low. If it's red, you're dangerously low and need to wave off immediately. This simple visual cue gave pilots a perfect, repeatable glide slope to follow, turning Flatley's concept into a scientifically precise procedure. Combined with the guidance of the landing signal officer on deck, the OLS made the constant angle approach the standard for every carrier in the fleet. The Madman's logic was now encoded in light. But the most profound legacy of James Flatley isn't just a technique or a piece of technology. It's a cultural shift. Before Flatley, the culture of carrier aviation often celebrated daredevilry. The best pilots were often the ones who took the biggest risks. Flatley championed a different kind of courage, the discipline to be safe. He understood that the goal wasn't just to land the plane, but to bring the pilot and the aircraft home safely every single time. He instilled a safety-first mindset that permeates naval aviation to this day. Every procedure, every piece of equipment, every pre-flight brief is built around mitigating risk. This culture, born from one man's refusal to accept the status quo, has saved thousands of lives and billions of dollars in aircraft. It's the understanding that true professionalism isn't about being reckless. It's about being perfect. So how does landing on a carrier today compare to the challenges of World War II? Is it still the hardest job in aviation? The answer is a resounding yes. The ships are bigger, but the planes are also faster, heavier, and far more complex. Today, as pilots are landing a 30-ton FA-18 Super Hornet on a moving runway that's less than 500 feet long, often at night, in rough seas. The stress is immense, and the physical and mental demands are off the charts. While technology like the OILs, and now the even more advanced Magic Carpet system, has made it safer, it hasn't made it easy. The fundamental challenge of hitting a tiny, moving target remains. But thanks to the foundation laid by Flatley, pilots now have the techniques, the tools, and most importantly, the safety-oriented mindset to do it successfully, day in and day out. When you look at the arc of naval history, it's filled with stories of grand battles and heroic figures. But sometimes, the greatest victories aren't won with guns, but with logic. James Flatley never commanded a fleet, but his contribution to naval aviation is just as significant. He saw a deadly problem and solved it not with brute force, but with intelligence, persistence, and a profound commitment to his fellow pilots. He proved that sometimes the most crazy idea is the one that makes the most sense. His powered approach wasn't just a new way to land. It was a new way to think, a philosophy that continues to protect the lives of pilots every single day. One man's logic, saving thousands of lives. Thanks for watching. If you found this piece of aviation history as fascinating as I do, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories about the engineering and ingenuity that shape our world. See you in the next one.